amazing. Hello, amazing artists. We are going to talk about Leonardo da Vinci and the golden ratio as soon as I can figure out how to make this full screen. View slideshow. Oh, good. There it is. Okay, so Leonardo da Vinci and the golden ratio. So we're taking our next project, we're taking Leonardo da Vinci as our inspiration, and I just wanted to teach you a little bit more about Leonardo da Vinci and all the stuff that makes him really cool. So Da Vinci was born in Italy, and not much was known about his childhood. He was trained in the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio, who at the time was a very famous painter in Florence, but he's not Da Vinci, so now you've only heard of him if you are a major art history nerd. Later, he lived in Milan and worked for the Medici family, which was one of the most powerful families at the time. Now, I know that that's easy to say that they were really powerful, but the Medici family kind of had their fingers in every pot. So the Medici family, they were really rich, and they would decide, oh, I want my son to grow up and be the Pope, and I want my other son to grow up and be the advisor to this king, and I want this son to be the most successful merchant ever. And then they would just go out and make it happen. And then that family would be able to say, hey, son, that's the Pope, hey, we want X, Y, and Z to happen. And at the time, the Catholic Church was really influential and important, and they could make things happen. So the Medici family was really kind of like a big deal. He died in France as the official artist of King Francis I. And he wasn't really making much art anymore at that point. It was really more like a status symbol for King Francis that he was able to take Da Vinci in when he was old and needed patronage and give him a place to stay in his final years. Da Vinci is regarded as the ideal Renaissance man. In fact, he was from the Renaissance, but if you've never heard the term Renaissance man, you might just think, oh, it's because he's from the Renaissance. But a Renaissance man, that term is a person who is really interested in good at lots of different things. He's most well known as a painter, but only 15 of his paintings survive today. He was also a sculptor, an architect, a musician, a scientist, a mathematician, an engineer, an inventor, an anatomist, someone who studies the body, a geologist, someone who studies rocks, a cartographer, which is somebody who creates maps, a botanist, and a writer. Da Vinci's notebooks, which he kept for his whole life, were world famous. Here are a couple of Da Vinci's surviving paintings. There's, of course, the Mona Lisa. This is the Madonna on the Rocks. We also have the Annunciation, which is a scene from the Bible, and then the Last Supper, which is painted on a wall in a church, which is why you can see a little doorway right here. This is considered, a really revolutionary painting because he used fresco as the way that he painted, and that was kind of like the first time ever anybody had ever done that. And a fresco is when you are mixing your wet paint directly into the wet plaster that creates the wall. So it's really hard for people whose job it is to conserve artwork to keep this painting from basically crumbling and falling off the wall. And it's really hard for them to restore the painting because this is in a church. So it's got smoke and all the things from candles in the church from years and years and years because, he was just a guy that painted this thing on the wall for a really long time before he became Leonardo da Vinci like we know him today. And so they just, used the church as a church. They weren't worried about preserving that painting, and now it's really given those conservationists like a really hard time. Da Vinci kept detailed notebooks during his lifetime. They were not always completely bound books. Often he would do a sketch on loose paper and then stick it in a notebook later. Also, back in this time period, sometimes when people had books, they would actually collect papers over time. And then when they got a certain number of papers together, they would have it bound into a book. So sometimes his notebooks are not chronological. Sometimes they are. It just kind of depends on like where in the process his notebook was made. If his notebook was just like, oh, I have a big enough stack of papers, I'm going to take it to the bookbinder, they might not be in any kind of discernible order. But if it was a book that he actually like opened up and day one started, it might be in a chronological order of his life, if not things that he, categorized in a way that makes sense to other people. He used his notebooks to design inventions, to study anatomy, to write backwards, and to just make observations about everyday life. Single pages from his notebooks have sold at auctions for millions of dollars. I know that Bill Gates bought a page out of one of Da Vinci's notebooks for a couple $1,000,000. Like, I mean, it's kind of like a really cool thing to own that, even though, they should probably be in museums so that people can learn from them. This is one of the reasons why in class we use sketchbooks, because I know it's a really good habit to get into, but I was inspired by Da Vinci to keep a sketchbook, and that's why I keep that going in our classes. All right, so here are some examples of Da Vinci's inventions. He was an inventor all on his own, but also when he was employed by the Medici family, they didn't employ him as an artist. They actually employed him as an inventor of weapons of war. So that's why a lot of his inventions are, are weapons, basically. So right here we have a tank, an armored tank. And up here we have a helicopter. I don't know that he ever got the helicopter to work. I'm also not sure if any of these inventions were ever actually made or if he just thought of them. But here are some examples. This is a device that was used for storming castle walls across moats so that you could get across the, alligator infested moat. And also here is a example of kind of like a machine gun. So it's a gun with lots of barrels, because back then they had to load each barrel of a gun individually in order to shoot. So that was the way that you could get lots of shots off at the same time. The cool thing about Da Vinci's inventions is that he would design flaws into his inventions so that if his notebooks or his ideas were stolen, people wouldn't be able to recreate the thing that he invented, because there would be that flaw in it and they wouldn't know what it was, and that would prevent the invention from working. For example, I heard that armored tank, that he actually designed the wheels so that they would turn in on each other so that the tank wouldn't go anywhere. There used to be a show on the Discovery Channel called Inventing Da Vinci, where they would take Da Vinci's plans and they would build his inventions, but in the process they had to figure out what exactly was the thing that he had designed into it that wasn't right. And when they went to test the thing that they made, it would either work because they figured it out, or it would break because they didn't figure it out. And I remember there was one episode where there was a catapult that they couldn't figure out what the flaw was, and it turned out it was the length of the pole on the catapult, and you would pull it back and the tension would break the pole. But they kept thinking it was a problem with the wood and not actually with the design. So that's just interesting. You could probably look that up on the internet at some point. He also studied anatomy, and I know that it seems like, okay, everybody studies anatomy, right? You learn about the bones in PE class. But for Da Vinci, back in this time period, they would think things like, oh, well, you have a fever, so you're obviously possessed by a demon. Or your humors are off. That was a big thing. You had these 4 humors, they thought. And if one was off and you got depressed, they would, cut your arm and bleed you into a basin, or they would put leeches on you, and that would help recorrect your humors. Or they would force you to vomit to fix your humors. And obviously, if you're sick, none of those things are going to help you. Those are just going to make you sicker. So Da Vinci would study anatomy by dissecting corpses, and that was highly illegal back then. We discussed already, the Catholic Church was really prominent and important, and they said that you couldn't desecrate bodies, so you couldn't dissect people to learn about how the inside of the body worked. So Da Vinci would have to pay grave robbers to dig up fresh bodies and bring them to him so that he could dissect them and make these detailed sketches that you see on the TV. That's kind of gross, but that's one of the ways that modern medical knowledge was furthered, was by people who did that. And now, of course, if you want to be a doctor, you still have to do things like dissect corpses, but those people have elected to donate their bodies to science so that doctors could learn about the inside of the body. We don't have to dig people up anymore, so that's good news. All right, the golden ratio. So the golden ratio was first studied because of its frequent appearance in geometry. It shows up in nature and kind of everywhere. Artists and musicians and designers have put the golden ratio into things, sometimes subconsciously and sometimes you know, sometimes on purpose. The golden ratio is 1.61. It's phi, P-H-I in the Greek alphabet. That's this right here. It's, you can see here's a mathematic representation of it. And this is a visual representation. You have 1.61, and then this is 1.61. And you see if you keep going, it creates this spiral. This is also similar to the Fibonacci sequence, if you've ever heard of that, which is a pretty cool, weird math thing. So you can see here that that spiral that is created by representing the golden ratio visually shows up in nature. You can see it here in this flowers here, and here in this nautilus shell. You can see that it's exactly the visual representation of the golden ratio. Same with the galaxies and all that. So I think the golden ratio is kind of a pretty cool thing. Also, designers will incorporate it into their designs for buildings and for photographs. And you can see Da Vinci use the golden ratio to figure out where he was going to put things in his paintings a lot. And you can see it in just like your life in general. Like you can see this violin, you've got 1 is the body of the violin, and then the 0.61 is the neck of the violin. This old design for Twitter was also based on the golden ratio, which I think is pretty cool, that it was just like out there in the world. And you can find things all over the place where the golden ratio works. And you can also find it in the body. And we're going to be using Da Vinci's ideal face, which you can see these are drawings of the ideal face right here. But we're going to be using it on our own selves so that we can get our own faces in the ideal face proportions. And these are all based on the golden ratio. And Da Vinci did all kinds of math, but I figured out a way to do it so that we don't have to do a ton of math, because that is not my strong suit. But if you want to know ways that the golden ratio shows up in the body, you just need to look at yourself. So remember that you are a growing person still, and you're not a full grown adult. So some of these ratios might not work exactly for you yet, but they will one day. So if you take your fingers and the distance between your thumb and your middle finger should fit directly around your wrist. And the space between both of your thumbs and middle fingers should go directly around your neck and be exact. All right. And also your neck is half of your waist, which is, I think, kind of cool. Your arm span is how tall you are. Your foot without a shoe on is the same length as your forearm, which is pretty cool. Your fingers, if you take 3 fingers, they're the same distance between your eyes, but they're also the length of the bridge of your nose, which I think is pretty cool. So that's all just like kind of like little ways that the golden ratio shows up in the body. So we are going to be doing some golden ratio self-portraits for this project, and I think it's going to be really cool. So I can't wait to get started.